technical virtual lunch and learn of the year. Today, we have a presentation on citizen science and accountability, a rare victory over an international plastics manufacturer. I'm going to go through a couple housekeeping slides and then we'll jump right into the presentations. We are recording this event, so that will be available on our YouTube channel. I will put the link in to the channel in the chat once everyone has logged in before the presentation ends. Everyone will be muted for the event. Please hold all of your questions until the end of the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and ask on camera, or you can keep your camera off and just unmute yourself. Or you can put questions in the chat and we will go through those once the presentations are over. We do have several upcoming events, so I want to make everyone aware of them. There is a distillery tour and networking event at Philadelphia Distilling on April 11th. We have a LEED Horticultural Center and Green Roofs tour at Morris Arboretum on May 11th. Networking night at the ballpark. We have a Reading Fight and Fills game with fireworks and food and drinks on June 6th. Our next virtual lunch and learn will be sometime in June on the importance of data management. We will bring back our Pennsylvania DEP regulatory update in July, and our touchstone ceremony will be on November 14th. That will be at World Cafe Live in Philadelphia. We also have several deadlines that are coming up. So if you know of an organization that could benefit from our grant program, that application is due April 12th. The scholarship program applications are due May 28th, and our Touchstone Award nominations are due August 1st. And I'm going to put in the plug that we're always looking for volunteers. It doesn't require that much of a time commitment. And if you are interested in volunteering for our board of directors to help out one of the committees, or even just to assist with a specific event, feel free to contact any of the board members or email info@swepweb.com. So I will let Jess Myers introduce our speakers.
Alrighty, thank you, Amy. It is my honor to introduce both Giselle Mazmanian and Dr. Jeremy Conkle. Giselle Mazmanian is an associate at Manco Gold, Catcher and Fox LLP, where she counsels clients on a range of environmental matters across sectors, including environmental law aspects of transactions, regulatory compliance, and environmental litigation. Prior to joining MGKF, Giselle worked as an environmental law associate for a leading Canadian law firm in Toronto for nearly a decade. Giselle has a unique understanding of the factors that impact environmental law, thanks to her previous experience working as an environmental scientist and consultant. Now she brings her technical expertise and science-based perspective to her legal practice to help clients assess risk, develop pragmatic solutions, and build strong legal and technical cases. In her free time, Giselle enjoys hitting the tennis court and going for a run. Dr. Jeremy Lennon Conkle is a senior chemist and toxicologist at the Delaware River Basin Commission, or DRBC. As a former associate professor at Texas A&M University Corpus Christi, he earned a dual bachelor's degrees in biology and chemistry at Longwood University, a Master's of Science in Environmental Studies from the College of Charleston, and a PhD in Oceanography and Coastal Sciences from Louisiana State University. He was a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Riverside. His research focuses on contaminant presence, fate, and impacts of aquatic systems. His early research examined contaminants like pharmaceuticals and personal care products in wastewater treatment wetlands, and their uptake in crops irrigated with treated wastewater. In his previous faculty position at Texas A&M University Corpus Christi, his lab focused on plastic and microplastic debris in rivers and coastal waters. At DRBC, he is continuing research on emerging contaminants, including PFAS, microplastics, tire wear particles, and 6-ppdq, while delving into the Delaware River Basin's water quality policy realm. From 2017 to 2020, Dr. Conkle was an expert witness on the Wilson versus Formosa Plastics Corporation trial, where Formosa was found guilty of illegally discharging hundreds of tons of pre-production plastic pellets and powder into Lavaca and Matagorda Bays. This is the largest settlement ever for a Clean Water Act case brought by a private entity. But more importantly, Dr. Conkle is a proud husband and father of 2 boys.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jess. I will get going. So I'm going to start off and then Dr. Conkle is going to take over. I'm going to set the stage. I'm going to tell you a bit about the Clean Water Act, permitting, and talk about the case. Before I start, I'm going to say a couple things about the firm that I'm at, Manco Goldcatcher and Fox. We're an environmental, energy, litigation, safety, and land use law firm. We offer a full range of regulatory compliance, transactional, and legal services, litigation services relating to our practice. We have 30 attorneys, and we're one of a few firms nationally to employ in-house technical consultants with engineering degrees. And we have offices in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Hawaii. So with that, we'll move on to the next slide, please. And I did sort of go over this. So this is what we'll be doing in the next 10 minutes, and then I'll pass it on to Dr. Conkle from there, who will do a deeper dive. Of course, he was an expert witness on the case and give us some of the inside scoop there. Okay. All right. So the Federal Clean Water Act, its purpose is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And as it applies to wastewater discharge, the primary Clean Water Act elements include establishing a system of minimum national effluent standards based on available treatment technology. And of course, as the available treatment technology changes over time, so too do the standards. There's also an establishment of water quality standard system, which also evolves as new contaminants are discovered and as we learn more about existing contaminants. And then, of course, there's the establishment of the NPDES, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which is a permit program providing enforceable limitations on dischargers. So the Federal Clean Water Act prohibits the discharge of any pollutant from a point source into navigable waters without an NPDES permit. I've underlined 2 of these terms to discuss briefly with you. The first is a pollutant, which is broadly defined. It includes any type of industrial, municipal, or agricultural waste discharged into water. And then a point source is any discernible, confirmed, and discrete conveyance. It can be a pipe, a ditch, a conduit, and so on. And I'll tell you a bit about NPDES discharge permitting. So a discharger can operate under what's known as a general permit by meeting the established parameters and submitting a notice of intent to operate under the general permit. And this is generally a quicker process for owners and operators. There's also the option of an individual permit, and this reflects site-specific conditions. And because of that, the application process takes a bit longer. Permits are typically issued for about 5 years. It could also be less. And test results are typically reported on a quarterly basis on a discharge monitoring report. And there may be other reporting obligations as well based on the individual permit. We also have non-compliance reporting obligations, and any condition which may endanger health, safety, or the environment, there's typically a 24-hour reporting requirement. And all of the reports that are submitted, they go into this publicly available EPA database called CODE. So NPDES permits provide for the inspection and collection of compliance verification sampling by the EPA or the state agency. The EPA or the state agency can enforce the NPDES permits by issuing compliance orders and initiating civil suits. And permit violations can also lead to criminal prosecutions, which can result in fines and more rarely can result also in jail time. And then finally, there are citizen suits that are authorized under the Clean Water Act. both against the entities that violate the standard and against the administrator of the EPA or the state agency for failing to carry out their discretionary duty. A non-discretionary duty. And so this last point is important because the case that we'll be looking at is a citizen suit, essentially, under the Clean Water Act, and resulted in the highest settlement amount. So there's a spoiler for the case. Next slide, please. So the EPA also has the ability to delegate authority for NPDES to states, and the involvement of states can vary. Some states are fully authorized to administer their own program, some partially, and some not at all. And as we see from the map here, it's a patchwork. So most states are authorized in some fashion to implement the NPDES program. And there are very few states that are not authorized. And so the EPA administers the NPDES directly in those cases. And states on top of that can have their own permitting structures, which can impose separate requirements. And I'm just going to pick out Texas here. So Texas is managed by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, and it's called TPDES. And the case that we're looking at takes place in Texas, which is why I'm pointing that out. Next slide, please. Okay, so with this sort of background on the Clean Water Act and the permitting regime, we'll turn to the case. It's the San Antonio Bay Estuarine Waterkeeper and Formosa Plastics. And this lawsuit was initiated in 2017 by Texas residents and members of the waterkeepers. And they sued Formosa Plastics under that, that provision of the Clean Water Act for citizen suits for violating the Clean Water Act by dumping pellets and plastic powder from Formosa's facility in Point Comfort in Texas into Lavaca Bay and Cox Creek, which are considered navigable waters. And prior to bringing the suit, the waterkeepers gathered a lot of evidence for over 3 years. They collected about or over 1,600 samples of pellets and plastic powders on almost 600 distinct days between January 2016 and March 2019. And so Formosa had 13 permitted outfalls, and the permit allowed for the treatment and discharge of wastewater and stormwater into Lavaca Bay and Cox Creek. The permit prohibited the discharge of floating solids or visible foam in other than trace amounts, and we'll talk about that a bit more. The TCEQ rules themselves also prohibited the discharge of floating debris and suspended solids into surface waters. And the permit also had a reporting requirement of reporting any floating solid violations in writing within 24 hours after each discharge event. Next slide, please. So Formosa's main defense was that the TCEQ wastewater permit was too ambiguous by prohibiting pellets in other than trace amounts, and Formosa argued that the term trace amount was not defined, and so there was no way of knowing exactly what that meant. So the court found that trace amounts means barely discernible quantity of a constituent, which is not easily identifiable in the environment. They took Dr. Kunkel's testimony that trace amounts of contaminants are very difficult to detect, and that you often need advanced instrumentation just to concentrate the contaminants enough to be able to observe and to analyze. So the federal district court judge held that Formosa is a serial offender, they said, of the Clean Water Act, and that Formosa was therefore liable for unauthorized discharges and for failing to report. And so, as I mentioned, there was a permitting requirement of reporting floating solid violations within 24 hours. So there was that reporting obligation, as well as a general obligation of reporting non-compliances that may impact human health and the environment. So what's usually the case is that there's a gap between a decision on liability and an assessment on damages. This is usually split up for various factors for efficiencies. And in that interim period, the parties settled the case essentially for $15 million. And the settlement amount was to be paid over 5 years into a fund that supports projects that reverses the damage of water pollution in Calhoun County. And on top of that, Formosa had to clean up the existing pollution and move to a zero discharge standard. So Formosa agreed to improve how its plant eliminates plastic pellets. And as part of the agreement, the plaintiffs were able to review decisions, make objections to anything from hiring an engineer to designing improvements to monitoring the company as it worked towards a zero discharge. And another element of the consent decree was that if Formosa was found to be in violation again, subsequent to the settlement, any documented discharge would be paid into the settlement fund, and year by year, the fine amount would increase in order to, deter Formosa from committing these violations. So with that, I will pass it on to Dr. Cole. Thank you.
All right, it's my turn. Thank you, Giselle. Let me get this queued up here. And play. All right, thanks for that great introduction, and you covered a lot of great background points that I probably would have missed from the legal side. So, like was said, I'm a senior chemist toxicologist with the Delaware River Basin Commission. I moved up here about a year ago, a year and 4 months ago. I left my faculty position down in Texas. So this is all work that I did before I moved up here. So it's independent of DRBC, but that's where I am now. So this is a good picture that it shows you an example of what some of the areas around Formosa looked like when they were discharging plastic pellets at the rates they were before the trial. This is a picture taken of an erosion cut on a boat ramp next to Formosa on the little creek that's there. And I'll try to point it out in a picture in a couple slides. What you see is oyster shells, which was like the base of the boat ramp. And you see soil that had, or sediment that had been deposited on top of that, followed by some clay on top. And when that bank eroded, it exposed all this. And you can see the pellets just enmeshed in the sediment there. And those are the pellets that Formosa was discharging just right next door. So a little primer on what that area is like. And so we're in Pennsylvania, and we have a lot of fracking and oil and gas exploration in this state, but that's also a big thing in Texas. So they have offshore oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico, and then onshore between Austin and San Antonio, there's the Eagle Ford Shale. And because of that, you have this offshore and onshore oil industry. You have the petrochemical industry right in the middle that processes all this oil. Not only just refining it for oil and gas, but also for products like plastics. So there are countless number of plastics manufacturers in this region, and there's many more that are being built year in and year out. So in Corpus, where we were, there was at least 3 going in, or that had just recently opened or going in while I was living there. And they were some of the largest plastics manufacturers in the world. This is Formosa. Formosa is located in Point Comfort, and I'll show you where that is on the next slide with a map. But this is their plant. On the left side of Formosa, that's the Lavaca Bay. On the right side, there's a creek. That's Cox's Creek, and that's where a lot of their discharge went. And just south of the road that goes there, right at the south of Formosa's properties, Route 35. On the other side of that is an Alcoa plant that is part of a mercury Superfund site where they discharged a lot of mercury into Lavaca Bay. So we did a lot of observations on this creek and in Lavaca Bay to assess what the plastic pollution was like. Okay, so looking at this map, Point Comfort here in the center. For some reason, my mouse is not showing up on the screen, but right almost directly in the center of the screen is Point Comfort. You can see the white spot where Formosa is surrounded by green, and that's because it's a pretty rural area. There's not much there other than Alcoa and Formosa Plastics. And So they were discharging into the creek next to the plant, as well as Lavaca and Matagorda Bays that are on the other sides of the plant. So Formosa is one of the main players in the story. The other is Diane Wilson, and Diane's down here on the right. Diane is a lifetime environmental activist. Reluctantly so. She's very quiet and does not like the spotlight, but she has done what she thought was right. And that's often resulted in her getting arrested and in trouble in many ways. So Diane's been arrested 15 times over the years for civil disobedience, starting back in the mid 80s when she realized how polluted her community was. At that point, Diane was a shrimper, like a third or fourth generation shrimper in the region. So she really cared about the bays. And at that time, shrimping was on the decline, and she saw this pollution and the reports of how polluted her county was as one of the reasons for that decline in shrimping. And so she's been fighting all the industry and what they've been doing to pollute that system since the 80s. She's been arrested for climbing the fence of the White House, during protesting of the war in Iraq. She attempted to sink her shrimp boat on the the wastewater outfall in Lavaca Bay for Formosa Plastics. She was only stopped in that effort by the Coast Guard, who was alerted by Formosa Plastics that she was going to do it because Formosa was paying her cousin about $60,000 to spy on her and keep an eye on her to see what she was up to. And he alerted Formosa that she was about to sink her shrimp boat on their potential spot for their wastewater discharge into the bay. And so she got arrested for that. So Formosa did a lot of shady things. And I saw some of it when I was there as well, with people kind of just following you around the community. And I know it sounds paranoid, but it legitimately, you had people following you around when we were working on this case. She also chained herself to the Union Carbide Tower, was jailed for 30 days. And then this picture was from 2021 at the end of Diane. She was, I think, 71, 72 at that time. She was on a 36-day hunger strike to try to get the Army Corps to stop a dredging project through the mercury hot zone in Matagorda Bay. And that project still hasn't gotten off the ground yet, and partially due to her protests and the efforts that she's doing to try to slow it down, because she's worried about the mercury being re-released into the bay system. Okay, so this is what it looks like out there in Lavaca, Matagorda, Cox Creek at times. This is from one of the first days I went out there and checked it out. This is basically one of the guys that did all the sample collection. He just reached down and grabbed a handful of this vegetation, pulled it up, and all you see there is organic matter, organic debris, just meshed with pellets, black and white pellets. Some pellets look new, some pellets look old, but there's pellets everywhere. And that's what it looked like at some spots around the plant and in the bay. Diane had been following Formosa for a couple of years, so she had been reporting what Formosa had been discharging to TCEQ for years. And based on what she said, TCEQ would come out, write up a little report, and then nothing would happen. So this happened over and over again. Other people submitted reports. So finally, Diane was able to get in touch with a nonprofit or a legal aid group, a Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, to represent her and bring this to trial. And honestly, they only brought this to trial because once they saw what she was seeing, they realized that they had a case and they had a chance to win. And not only that, but they had a group of people in that community that were willing to do the work to document what they were seeing, so that they could present that information at trial and build their case. And so they did all this voluntarily. There was no funding behind it. It was just these people in the community that were interested in stopping what Formosa was doing. All right. So I was an expert witness. I got a call from a lawyer in November 2017, which is always scary. And then I called her back and she explained to me what was going on, and I agreed to try to take a look at it and see what I could do. And so that picture on the previous slide was from my first visit, but I went up there and checked it out, and it really is shocking how much plastic there was. And so I was tasked with three things: research, write, and defend what I wrote. And the research and the writing, that's what I'm used to doing. For those of you that have been through grad school and had defenses, oral exams, you know how nerve-wracking that can be. And so what I had to do for the defense part was I had to sit through a deposition, which ended up, if you're in grad school, you get 1 or 2 hours of exams and oral exams and things like that. This was a 6-hour deposition where I had to defend everything that I wrote in that report, which was like a 30 or 40 page report about the environment and the plastics in Matagorda and Lavaca Bay. And I thought the trial was going to be the hard part, but it was really the deposition. The trial was only 30 minutes. So I was really quick. But let's talk about what I did now and what the people did in that case to become victorious. And so, as Giselle mentioned, this is a Clean Water Act case. And Formosa had probably been discharging plastics for almost 30 years, but nobody had been able to get to this far with them and hold them accountable. And so at the start of when they filed the lawsuit, they were asking for by the time we went to trial, they were asking for up to $250 million in damages, which is essentially the cumulative fines that would have been enforced had the Clean Water Act actually worked to keep Formosa from polluting. And so that's how it looked when it went to trial. That's the damages they were asking for. It would have been no jury trial. It would have been just a judge trial. So it would have been one person deciding the outcome of this trial, not 12. And then there's two phases, as Giselle mentioned. There's I don't know what the first phase is technically called, but it's where they have the trial to determine if Formosa was found guilty. If Formosa was found guilty, it would move to the second phase, which is damages, where they would discuss and there'd be essentially a second trial where they would figure out how much Formosa owed, and that money would then go to the federal government. Either, I can't remember, it was the Department of Justice or the EPA, but it wouldn't have stayed in the community. So that's how this works, and that fact that the money might not stay in the community is part of the reason why this went to a settlement after they were found guilty. But that whole process can take a couple of years, so it's a pretty drawn out process. So let's look at who was involved on Diane's side to help collect the data. So this group is really citizen scientists. They have no scientific background. They just went out and collected samples. Part of my task was to help them make sure that the samples they were collecting were defensible in some way in court. And they were really already doing that. They were basically collecting grabs of whatever they saw. They would also take pictures, videos, and they shared all this stuff digitally. They wrote little notes with every physical sample they collected. So it was really impressive. Diane, she was a shrimper, so she was probably the closest one to an actual scientist of this group. And then the two people that did probably the most, I would say, field work were David Sumter and Ronnie Hamrick, which are in that middle picture. Ronnie was a supervisor at the plant. And so he saw firsthand how they skirted the law and encouraged people not to report the release of plastics. And I believe David also worked there as well. But those two literally went out every day or every other day for 3 years and collected samples. Bob Lindsay on the right is Diane's partner. Bob is the furthest from this case as far as his experience. He was, a scout for the Cincinnati Reds in Europe. And then he met Diane and he settled in down here in Texas. And so these four folks, as well as a couple others on and off, helped collect samples and catalog everything over the 3 years where they were trying to build their case against Formosa. As Giselle mentioned, one of the things that was central to this case was language in their permit that said they shall not discharge anything other than trace amounts. And this is really at the heart of what my objectives were for this case, was to try to define or at least show the difference between what was being discharged and what is a trace amount. So I'm going to show you pictures over the next few slides about what I experienced, what I observed, which was technically the evidence or the data that we collected in this case. And so keep that in mind. I know everybody kind of has this understanding of what trace is, but like the permit, it's probably not that clear to you. And the permit definitely had, as Giselle mentioned, no definition for this term. And this is common in a lot of the permits in Texas for the other plastics manufacturers. It may not say trace amounts, but it has something similarly vague. And solids in this case, in this language here, is plastics for Formosa. Okay, pictures here. This is also from the first days I went out there in December 2017. I was pretty much in disbelief from the time I got out there, seeing all the plastic. I had seen maybe a few pellets before I got up there throughout all the other work I've done. And they were everywhere when you walked around the shoreline of Cox Creek next to the plant. So you can see them in the organic matter here in the little fish net. And then the pool net on the right, you can see little specks of plastic all over the rim of the net. And then you see a few pellets stuck in there as well. But so what we're looking at is there's pellets And then there's also these flakes that look really small and fine. And that's like a waste byproduct. That's polyethylene and polypropylene. Formosa makes both of those chemicals. So the pellets you're seeing are mostly polyethylene and polypropylene. Those flakes and little dots you're seeing in there, that's polyethylene and polypropylene. They also make PVC powder, but that wasn't really a part of the lawsuit because it was super fine and almost, if you sneezed over it, you'd blow it everywhere. So it's really fine. And that was too hard to look at or find or detect for this type of work or for this case. So we didn't really focus on that. It was mostly these pellets and this flakes from this waste product that they generated. And here's a quick video, and sorry it's moving so fast, but you can see all the little white specks on the ground. Those are pellets right next door to the plant. When the creek would rise, when they got a lot of rain, it would overflow the banks and flood up there and discharge and deposit all these pellets, and then the water would recede and the pellets would stay there. So you could see this, it just covers the ground. In Lavaca Bay, on the other side of the plant, the rack line on some days when we went up there would just be coated in that flaky powder of polyethylene and polypropylene. And you can see in this picture in the bottom right of the plastic bag, you can just grab handfuls of this stuff out of the rack line. And the rack line is that organic matter that floats up with high tide, it gets deposited, and then the tide recedes. And so all of this stuff just floated right in that rack line and accumulated in lines right down the beach. So again, keep in mind what you think about when I say trace amounts and what you're seeing in these pictures. This video, this is from June 2018. I was driving up through the area that day, and we'd also been having a major rain event. We had about 10 inches of rain over 3 days. And so this is at that boat ramp next to on Cox's Creek, next to the plant. And so all this white stuff you're seeing is that white flake and powder. And you can see it's just coating the boat ramp. That's Ronnie's arm. He's standing on the boat ramp, and you can see it just covering this little area where the boat ramp is. It's just everywhere. And then when you look in closer, you can see it looks like all the flakes and kind of byproduct or waste product there on the water. But when you zoom in and look at the pictures, you can see there's lots of pellets in there as well. And same with those pictures I showed in the last one. When that water rose and then receded, it deposited a lot of pellets on the shoreline and up on the boat ramp. So you can see them mixed in with the grasses. And this happens, in Cox Creek, but this also happened in Lavaca Bay. When hurricanes come in, it would rise up and flood out into the banks, deposit the plastics, and then the water would come back in, leaving all that plastic behind on the shoreline. This is all the data that Diane and Ronnie and everybody collected. Basically, like I said, these weren't scientists. They were just folks trying to hold Formosa accountable. This is in Diane's little aluminum barn outside of her house. And there's probably 2,000, 3,000 samples of plastics in here that go with the tens of thousands of videos and pictures they took that are digitally saved. And so you can see in some of these, you can see little notes on the bags. But there's actually a lot of samples in here that are basically floating plastic debris they just collected in like a water bottle they found that was trash on the shoreline. So they have all these crazy samples. I think at the time of the trial, they had collected over 2,500 samples, and they took every one of those to the courtroom. And they actually had to take them into the basement of the courthouse because the judge wouldn't allow them in the room. But then the judge had himself and all the legal teams go down in the basement and look at them and have Diane talk about them. Okay, so I think Giselle mentioned this, that TCQ didn't really do a whole lot. They were notified and didn't do much. But then once they were sued, they started to do some things to try to clean up or make themselves look a little better. And one of the things they did was clean up. And Giselle showed a picture of Formosa contractors cleaning the shoreline right there next to the boat ramp. With power washers. They did this all up and down the shoreline, and they did it in this haphazard way. So when you are on a shoreline, everything is kind of held together by the vegetation. So once you remove that vegetation, everything starts to erode. And if you're taking power washers out there, you're basically killing the plants, all the soft stem plants, and you're exposing all the roots. So you're killing all the bigger plants as well. And then you're letting all that sediment wash in. And so they were doing this and then collecting all the plastic that washed down in the water with dip nets. So that was their cleanup method, was to basically scour the banks, kill all the vegetation, disturb the soil, wash the plastic down, scoop it off, put it in a trash bag, throw it in a landfill. Now, that's terrible in itself, but it's actually really beneficial to our case. When Formosa's contractors did this, they had to document what they were removing. It was part of, I guess, their contract with Formosa, so they could document how much they were cleaning up. And maybe Formosa thought this was good, that they could say, look, our guys are cleaning up this much. We're making a difference. We're making it better. We're fixing it. But it actually helped us a lot too, because when they did that, they estimated, they kept account of the bags. And then during the deposition, Diane's lawyers asked, how much material was in each bag? And so they gave us a number. And then he asked how much plastic is in that material. And so they gave a range. And so we have these numbers. And from that, knowing the densities and the size of the plastic pellets, we can estimate not only the mass of the plastic they cleaned up, but also the number of pellets they cleaned up, which came in handy at trial. So these are the numbers of the bags that they cleaned up. And so the numbers that their contractors estimated was that each bag was 20 to 25% full, and that each bag had, of that material, 10 to 40% of that debris was plastic. And so I can take these numbers, and actually gave them a little more wiggle room. I said, okay, let me estimate 5 to 40% of the material being plastic. So they had a lower end on the conservative side. And these are the number of bags they cleaned up. So over 2.5 years, they cleaned up 85,000 bags of debris. And keep in mind, a lot of that is organic matter they washed off or killed. But a lot of that was also plastic. So with these numbers, we can then estimate ranges for materials removed. And this was really helpful. Tons of plastic, anywhere from 171 to 1,600 tons, 161 or 171 to 1,600 tons of plastic debris was removed from Cox Creek and Lavaca Bay. And now most of that's Cox Creek because that's where I think 9 or 10 or 11 of their stormwater outfalls are. And then there's the main one in Lavaca Bay is a wastewater discharge, but they're still discharging from both. So most of it's Cox Creek. So this is a massive amount of plastic. And at the beginning, they said, oh, we don't waste anything because it's all product and we would lose money. But clearly they're discharging a lot. Now, we can also estimate the number of pellets that they discharged. And the reason that's important is because Formosa tried to define trace amounts according to some number they made up. I still don't know how they got this number, but Formosa wanted to define trace amounts as 74,827 pellets a day, which is a lot. And 660 in the Lavaca Bay. So 74,000 in Cox Creek, they could discharge 660 into the Lavaca Bay. And that has to do with the number of discharges they have. Because I could estimate the number of pellets, I could do some math on this. And the total pellets that we estimate they removed on Cox Creek was almost 7 billion to 68.5 billion. On Lavaca Bay, 600 million to 6.5 billion, right? So if you take their number that they wanted to use, 74,000 pellets per day in Cox Creek, and you use this range of pellets that we estimated they cleaned up, it would have taken them 250 years or 2,500 years to discharge all of that plastic at that rate. So they clearly didn't know what they were doing when they made up that number. And they probably thought it was conservative, but it really didn't even come close to the number of pellets they actually discharged. So that disproved that number they wanted to use. And they also tried to compare plastics to mercury, which is apples to oranges, right? It's not the same thing. But they went down that road, so we did too. And they said, mercury, we can discharge 0.01 milligrams per liter of mercury. Okay, so if there's 22,000 pellets in a pound, 0.01 milligrams of plastic is only 5/10,000ths of one pellet. So if they're going to discharge and try to equate milligrams per liter to of mercury to a plastic pellet, sure, like you can only discharge 1 or 5/10,000ths of one pellet to get that limit per liter. And so if they're discharging, billions of pellets over the 3 years or whatever that we calculated that, they still are not even close to that metric. So they again shot themselves in the foot with that. Okay, so back to this trace amounts definition. There's lots of ways to define this, but I think what the evidence showed and what we observed throughout this is that even if they were in the gray area, we would have had problems, but they weren't even close to the gray area of what could be considered trace amounts. They were well beyond that, discharging who knows how many pounds or tons per year of plastics. But, hundreds of tons is what was cleaned up at a minimum, probably closer to 1,000 tons. So, and one thing I didn't mention is when they would clean up sites in Cox Creek, they would spend a few weeks there, sometimes a month, clean up there, go to another site, spend a month there, and then they'd have to go back to those sites they already cleaned up and clean up again. So they were clearly still discharging a lot of pellets and things were moving around that creek. So the trial began March 25th, 2019. It lasted for about a week. And then we had to wait until June, I believe, the end of June for the judge to make his ruling. And then we were going to have to wait until, I think it was either October, November, or December of that year before the damages phase started as well. But let's before I get into that. So this is some of the quotes from the judge, and this was in the Texas Tribune in 2019. The evidence demonstrates that Formosa has been in violation of its permit concerning discharge of floating solids since January 31st, 2016. And that date is in there because that's when the lawsuit was filed, or part of the lawsuit, I guess, timeline. But they, as far as Diane can tell, they've been discharging plastics since they started, and they were actually sued or fined by the EPA tens of millions of dollars already for this. They had other issues long before this, but TCEQ still had never done anything to reel them in. And so since that date, and that the violations are enormous, Hoyt, who's the judge, described Formosa as a serial offender and noted the company has argued that they got fined for 6 violations by TCEQ after they were sued, and that they basically wanted to dismiss this lawsuit after that because they got 6 violations held against them for $121,000. But the judge ruled that didn't come close to covering it, that it was moot. And he said, based on the overwhelming evidence, the TCEQ's finding and assessment merely show the difficulty or inability of TCEQ to bring Formosa into compliance with its permit restrictions. So the judge in this statement is saying not only is Formosa the bad actor here, but that TCEQ either chose not to or could not bring Formosa into compliance. So he's not only saying Formosa is a bad actor here, but TCEQ is also at fault to some extent. The company was in violation of law for some 1,149 days. He noted, and again, that's because that's the timeline for the lawsuit, not because they've only been discharging that amount or for those days. The evidence showed that Formosa had never reported a single discharge of floating solids to TCEQ. So they were sticking by this. We're only discharging in trace amounts, and that's ambiguous. So we're not going to notify anything. But as Giselle mentioned, they had a duty to report, and they never did that once. So in this, the judge made that ruling, and then a few months went by. They were prepping for the next phase of the trial, and TRLA, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, who was Diane's law firm that was representing her, reached an agreement with Formosa. And this agreement, as Giselle mentioned, was for $50 million, but it had all other kinds of great parts to it. So the $50 million would stay in the community. It wouldn't go up to the federal government, as often happens with Clean Water Act verdicts. So the money stayed there. None of this money goes to Diane or the waterkeeper. It goes to projects in the community to help fix issues in that community. A lot of it went to plastics. $1 million went to nodal patrol, and I'll show you a little bit more about that on the next slide. And then a lot went to research, education, outreach, camps for little kids. Some of it's going to a co-op to help try to revive the shrimping industry that's been in decline in those bays since the 1980s. So there's a whole lot of good that's going to come out of that. And one of the most important things was that zero pellet discharge, that they will be held accountable for discharges in the future. And those fines will continue basically until they stop discharging pellets. And these fines are different than the administrative framework of TCEQ. So this is all within the consent decree. So those fines are not passed through TCEQ or anything like that. They go straight into the trust. And so some updates on what has happened since then. So plastics are still being released, and I got the latest numbers from Diane about a week ago. So they've been monitoring for about 2.5 years, of which Jess, who introduced us, was part of that for a little bit while she was down in Texas. So they've been monitoring for about 2.5 years. And monitoring is done every 2 to 3 days, sometimes more frequently. Over that time, they've recorded 587 violations, which is basically every time they've gone out to look to see if Formosa is discharging plastic, they are still discharging plastic. And those fines have resulted in $15.74 million additional that goes to that trust. And the trust gets to determine how that money is dispersed in the community. That monitoring is supposed to continue for at least 5 years, but it won't stop until there have been 6 consecutive months where there has not been a violation. And so if they haven't made 1 or 2 days without a violation, it's going to be a long time before those fines stop. And the amount of the fine ramps up. So it started at $20,000 the first year. By the year 5, it's $40,000. So they're starting to get into that more expensive range. And so each fine accumulates more and more money that goes into the trust to help mitigate the effects of this pollution. Nerdle Patrol, it's an app. It's a website you can go. It's run by Jace Tunnel, who's now at my old university in Texas. And basically it's a citizen science project where you can go out on the beaches and look for pellets and report them. And there's data globally, but there's a lot focused on the Texas coast in the US. In 2023, Diane Wilson was awarded the Goldman Prize, which is essentially the highest honor for work in the environmental field. And a lot of people that win the Goldman Prize have either been threatened or even harmed or sometimes even killed for the work they've been doing to protect the environment in their area. There's one winner from each continent each year, and Diane got the US's award last year. And it's a huge honor. If you click on that QR code underneath her, that takes you to her page on the Goldman Prize website, and you can see more about her story and the work that she's done. And then the other QR code here on the bottom is from a show on Netflix called Dirty Money. And there's only 2 seasons of this, but episode 5 of season 2 is based on Formosa Plastics and what they've done worldwide, the problems they've had. But it focuses largely on Diane and what she did here in Texas, or down there in Texas. So just some things to wrap up here, because I know we're running short. This case, I don't think would have been possible 20 years ago, largely because of technology. The smartphones we have in our hands can do some pretty scary things in tracking us, but they can also allow us to take and collect data in ways that we could not do that 20 years ago. We can take and share digital videos, not even just videos, but really high quality videos and photographs, and share them digitally very easily without having to go print out photos or save videos on cassettes and things like that. So it's really, really impressive what you can do with the technology today. And then as scientists, this is my little spiel at the end about what scientists can do. Teach people in your community about basics of sample collection. So if there is a problem, they know how to collect samples and the data to show what's going on. Introduce citizens to existing tools. So there's apps like Solocator, the top image there on the right of the screen. It basically stamps all photos you take in that app with like date, time, geolocation information, and stuff like that, so that it can be defensible in court. And then if you're in engineering, in engineering, you can do a lot of other things too. You can build tools, build apps. Stroud Stroud Center, I can't remember their full name, but Stroud does a lot of great work with this, where they build, almost DIY apps and sensors. So if you're technologically, able to build some of this stuff, that could be something you could do as well to help out. All right, I sped through that, so I'm sorry, but we're close to the end. And I just want to say, this is not just a problem. While, that's Lavaca Bay, Matagorda Bay in Texas is a major problem. We have the same problem here. This was a picture of some pellets I collected on an island across from Chester, Pennsylvania, right out in the Delaware River in August last summer. So there are pellets here too, obviously not as bad as the Lavaca Bay, but we still have this issue here as well. All right, and that's everything for me.
Incredible. Thank you both, Giselle and Jeremy, for your time and your talks. I know it's a really special story to my heart and things that I've done. So if y'all have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or unmute yourself. And ask? One of the questions I see is, couldn't Formosa filter their discharge to recover their plastics prior to release of the wastewater?
Yes, they could. And it's somewhat simple and somewhat complex. You know, in that area, they get big pulses of rain. Like I said, we got 10 inches of rain in a couple of days. So that can overwhelm a system. But Formosa also had put in like kind of Band-Aids on the problem for years and never really invested heavily in the right kinds of containment or treatment operations. And so they would put in a screen, the screen would clog, they just pull out the screen and let the water flow and then put the screen back down. So they would do stuff like that. They are doing a lot better now. I know that they are still discharging, but the amounts that they're discharging are much, much lower. So they've made improvements. So you have to give them credit for that. But yeah, they could still do better, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I can also chime in with my work with Formosa. They did use a series of filters and a net. And what we saw was about 10% of the wastewater that they filtered. And that's what we used to quantify their charges.
What other questions do you have?
We also have, why are these plastic pellets harmful to the environment? Like, what about them kind of is separate from like a regular plastic pollution issue that we see?
So, you know, there's obviously the visual aspect of this, right? They shouldn't be discharging all this stuff. They're essentially litter that they are discharging. And, you know, if anybody else were to just dump tons of plastics out of their car window, you know, that'd be a serious problem. And so they should not be allowed to do that. From a toxicology standpoint, you know, there's the chance that something could eat these. You know, we didn't document that or have direct evidence. We had a lot of stories of fishermen that would basically look inside the guts of fish they were catching to see what they're eating and that they found pellets. None of those fishermen wanted to testify in this case, which is unfortunate because Formosa was a major employer. They just didn't want to get wrapped up in it. And you know, some of them have family that worked for Formosa, or they might have worked for Formosa themselves. But yeah, there's that issue. You know, there's a lot of chemicals that are added to plastics and the additives, and we're not sure what's in them. We didn't have the resources to analyze all of that either. But there's a lot of other issues, you know, from a physical standpoint of, you know, just consumption and potential issues there. But I would say the biggest thing is they just shouldn't be discharging this material because it's essentially litter that you and I, if we discharge that much, would get in a lot of trouble for.
Thank you. Another question we have is, why doesn't TCEQ enforce their permits? Have they revised their language to be more specific based on this case?
TCEQ has to revise permits. I think it's every 5 years. I'm not sure how this permit has changed since this case was resolved, but I'm sure that they're probably, you know, trying to find ways to be a little more specific. But in Texas, there's a laissez-faire approach. You know, TCEQ, when I got there, I was told TCEQ is there to make sure that everybody is in compliance with the EPA, but not to stop them from doing what they want to do, really. They just kind of help them get around the laws and the rules. Now, that's just what I was told, but you tend to see that there in Texas, right? They have a lot of major polluters and emitters, and the reporting is not to par with what's being released. So there's a lot of question marks about what they actually put out. And TCEQ doesn't do a lot of major fines. They just don't. So I don't, you know, I can't speak to the politics of that necessarily, but, you know, they don't do a lot of great enforcement of these issues.
I can sort of add a comment to that generally in terms of state agency enforcement. The reality is it's underfunded for the most part, you know, very few resources to sort of be able to go out and do the work that the water keepers did in this case. So that's definitely part of it. And in this case, as Dr. Conkle pointed out, TCEQ did document, I think it was like 6 or 7 dates of violations, and that's what they ended up fining Formosa for. So what's 6 or 7 days versus like 600 whatever days that the water keepers were able to get? Like, that obviously requires a lot more time and energy on one case as opposed to the reality of the state agencies having, you know, many situations to deal with.
Yeah, and those fines that Formosa handed, or that TCEQ handed down to Formosa, weren't even close to the maximum or what they could have fined for MOSA. I think the max they could have fined was like $40,000 per discharge or per discharge point per day or whatever. And there were 6 discharges, they only fined them 120,000. So it was like half of what they could have actually fined them. So even when they can fine folks, they seem to not fine them what they're able to fine them or legally allowed to fine them.
Sure. Similarly, what does this case mean for future plastics regulations?
I haven't kept up with that too much, but my guess is you have other companies that are looking at ways to see if they can tighten up what they're discharging to make sure they don't discharge as much. And, Formosa is this one example where, no matter how much they get fined or how much money they're hemorrhaging to the lawsuits, they seem to not care because they're making so much other money at this point. Like the estimates that we were told was that they make close to $1 billion a year at that facility. So $50 million is a lot of money, but it's a drop in the bucket when you're making $1 billion at that facility. And so, that also means what's $1 million to upgrade or $10 million to upgrade some equipment one time to save you all this money long term. So I'm sure there's a lot of other facilities in Texas that are looking at ways to make sure they're not releasing as much. And maybe they're doing a better job of asking for stricter language in their permits. I don't know. But yeah, and around the world, it's not as big of a deal. But when you have places like Texas where the laws aren't as enforced, this is when you have these kind of worst case scenarios, I think.
Yeah, my colleagues and I were actually talking the other day about microplastics being the next sort of emerging contaminant that will be regulated. As we see with PFAS, it started off small and now we're seeing all these regulations. So I think that's next to come because the law is oftentimes reactive to society and what people are advocating for.
Wonderful. Are there any last questions before we end the talk here?
I'll add one other thing. There was a legal journal that came out a couple years ago with an article that basically said that this case set precedent for citizen science to be used or to be admissible in court. So that's one of the really cool things about this case is that it actually, not only did they win, but they also set precedent for future cases that show that citizen science or community collected data is admissible at trial and can be used in some cases to, hold people accountable.
That's incredible. Thank you for that. And thank you both for your time. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. See you all later.
Have a good one.
Bye.